So we're going to invite Rich to come and speak in a moment. Before that, I'm just going to read from Acts 2, verses 42 to 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to everyone as he had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So let's make Rich feel very welcome.
Thank you so much. So good to be with you. My name is Rich. I'm one of the leaders here at King's, and we're in this all-in teaching series. And I just want to say up front a huge thank you to your response to this series so far. The conversations I've had with people, there just seems to be an excitement about the direction God is leading us in and about that call to be all in. So thank you for your response. This is a wonderful church, and it is a privilege to be part of this church. As I said last week, right throughout this series, we're going to keep coming back to what we see in the early church, and particularly in that passage that we've just heard from Acts 2. Of course, the early church was not perfect. And you see this as you read through the book of Acts. Like us, they were just ordinary people who were trying to follow Jesus. But if we're going to go after the things that God is leading us into, then there are things in the early church that we can really learn from. So I spoke last week about the sense of belonging in the early church. Did you notice in that passage, as Ruth just read it, just in those 6 verses, 3 times you heard the word together. They met together, they ate together, they were together. They were never coerced into it. They were just a people who loved coming together, united around their love for Jesus. But what you also cannot fail to notice in the early church, as well as their togetherness, was their extraordinary generosity. Their extraordinary generosity. I said last week there are 5 areas where we believe God is asking all of us to be all in. Those 5 areas are belong, give, pray, serve, and reach out. And this morning we're looking at the second of those, at give. One thing we feel God is leading us into right now is to become a resource church. And I'll explain more about that later on. But what's important to say up front is that when it comes to New Testament teaching on giving, it's always about the heart. It's always about the heart. A few years ago, I was chatting with a good friend of mine. He was a friend who'd grown up in church, but he'd turned away from his faith. And we were out together one night, and he said to me, you know, Christianity, it's just like communism. And what he meant was this. He saw that in the early church, as we see in that passage in Acts 2, the believers gave up money and possessions for a common cause. It said in verse 44, all the believers had everything in common. In verse 45, it said they sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. But of course, here's the point. This is not a governmental structure that was imposed on them. This is not something they had to do because someone made them do it. No, this was how they chose to live in response to what Jesus had done for them. See, just as they gave their time, they gave their money because their hearts have been transformed by Jesus. It's always about the heart. We see this in Jesus teaching about money and giving in the New Testament. There's lots of that. And we see it in Paul's letters, that it's always about the heart and the motivation. If we ever find ourselves in that mindset of, oh no, the church are asking me for more money, how much money do I have to give? Well, actually, we miss the point and we miss the joy, and the invitation is to come back to Jesus. One of the most in-depth teachings in the Bible about giving is in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. Now, I don't have time to unpack that this morning, but there Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he's encouraging them to give to a collection to support victims of a famine. And the way he does it is he shows them the example of the generosity of the Macedonian church. And the Macedonian church wasn't a rich church. They didn't have much at all, but when they saw the needs around them, and when they grasped what Jesus had done for them, Scripture says their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. And so as Paul encourages the church in Corinth, he says to them, since you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in the love we have kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. And it's not compulsion, it's not a command. Paul is just saying, out of the grace that you've been shown, I want you to want to do this. I want you to want to give. We're going to do things a bit differently this morning. I'm going to come back up later on to speak into a new way of giving at Kings. But first, we're going to watch a video together. And it's about 20 minutes long. And it was filmed at a learning community that a few of us were at last autumn. It's a guy called Richard. And very sadly, Richard passed away just a few weeks ago. But he leaves a legacy of generosity that is both inspiring and incredibly challenging. It challenged me when I was there, when I saw this talk last year, but it also challenged me when I watched it again this week. But more, it stirred me to the wonderful generosity of God and to the adventure that he's inviting us into. So let's watch this video together.
Richard, and I'm dying. And I thought I'd tell you my story. I work in financial services, and one of my favorite clients, their headquarters is in Brussels. And if you go into the men's toilets in their offices in Brussels, in front of each men's urinal is a sheet of A4. It's laminated for obvious reasons, and it has on it what's called their lessons from the loo. It's basically all the deals that went south where they've lost 20, 30, 40, 50 million, and the lessons that they've learned. So what I'd love to share with you is my lessons from the loo of life when it comes to money. I became a Christian when I was 16. For the first half of my life, first 20 years, God called me to be a professional actor. That didn't involve making a lot of money, you'll be surprised to know. I was taught, give the first 10% to the church and the other 90% you can do with what you want. Actually, we couldn't afford orange juice, we couldn't afford biscuits, didn't amount to much. And then in the late 90s, I was in Japan doing some Shakespeare. I'd been away from home for 5 months. And our third daughter was born, and I cried out to God for a way to earn a living that didn't involve living out of a suitcase. And he very graciously answered my prayer. I was asked, long story cut short, by the chairman of one of the largest companies in the world that I'd never heard of to kind of help him do his speeches and do his communication. And that started a journey of what we and my team do for the last 25 years. Basically, we help people persuade other people to give them hundreds of millions of pounds. And the challenge of that is I would find myself earning in half a day or a day what I had been earning in a week, 2 weeks, a month as an actor. What did I do with that? Well, 10% went to the local church. The rest of it, I'd been told, was mine to do with what I wanted. So what did I do? I looked around my church, I looked around my town where I live. Without even thinking about it, I inflated my lifestyle. What had been holidays in the UK became holidays abroad. What was wool became cashmere. The kids went to private school. We moved house every 5 years because we could, up and up and up the property ladder. And after a while, I felt a deep disquiet that was the right thing to do. And you know, Jesus tells the story about the farmer who has excess at the end of the year and builds barns. Can you remember the word that Jesus uses to describe that farmer? A fool. I was that fool. I came to the conclusion that I was a living embodiment of foolishness. Now, Jesus has some advice, actually, kind of at the back end of that story. He says, be rich towards God. But what did that actually look like? So I started to do some research, and what I found staggered me. If you take evangelical Christians in the world, 20% of them reside in the West, let's call it North America, Europe, the UK, and 80% reside in the rest of the world. So you've got the wealthy church and the poor church. The wealthy church, evangelical Christians in the West, guess every year what proportion of our income we give away. 2.5%. I came to the somewhat shocking conclusion that I was one of the greediest generations of evangelical Christians ever to inhabit planet Earth. We give our 2.5% to our local churches on the whole. They spend roughly, statistically, 50% on buildings, 25% on a staff team, 10% on missions. Some of that goes abroad. Net, what does that mean? That means for every £100 that God gives to evangelical Christians in the West, 25p goes outside the West, 0.25%. And this didn't strike me as fair. So what was my responsibility to that? I didn't consider myself wealthy. I basically drove a Ford Mondeo estate. I had clients who earned 100 million a year. They were wealthy, I wasn't. And I did the research. Guess how much you have to earn to be in the top 1% of the wealthiest people on the planet? £30,000 a year. I was earning more than £30,000 a year. I was at the top of God's financial pyramid. If God wanted to fund his work around the world, I'd be the first person that he came to. So what did I do? I opened a stewardship account. We upped our giving percentage. And then the question was, well, who do we give to? So at the time, my local church was raising $4 million for a building refurbishment program. And I can remember saying to my vicar, I'm not sure if God had $4 million spare, he'd invest it in that. Now, leaving aside the extraordinary hypocrisy of me saying that, having moved from a perfectly fine 4-bedroom house to the 5-bedroom house that was my doer-upper, leaving aside that hypocrisy, I still thought that was the right thing to say. So we did support our local church, but also we determined that most of it would go overseas, because that's where the huge opportunity for the gospel is, and that's where the massive needs are. So my clients are very smart investors, and one of their principles are invest in great people doing great things. So that's what I prayed for, great people doing great things. There was a girl in our church. She'd just come back from her gap year. She was 18 years old. She went to Romania, and in her gap year, she found 5- and 7-year-olds sleeping off the streets, so she started an orphanage in her gap year. She wanted money. There was money in our pot, in our stewardship pot. We supported her. Then my business partner took me to Uganda, to an orphanage there. I didn't want to go to Africa, frankly. The idea horrified me, but he dragged me there. He bribed me to go there. And what I found astonished me. I found couples who'd moved into the African bush. This was at the height of the AIDS crisis. Christian couples. And they built a house, and the house had 3 rooms. In the first room, they put 7 beds for the 7 orphan girls they adopted. In the second room, they put another 7 beds for the 7 orphan boys they adopted. In the third room is where they lived. And I suddenly had this epiphany. I'm not part of some irrelevant subculture of Christians in the UK believing weird stuff. I'm part of a global network of inspirational, extraordinary people doing amazing things. And they could do with my help. And I had enough money in the pot to help them. I can remember taking my daughter there, and we went on holiday to one of Uganda's national parks. It's beautiful. And when I was on holiday, I suddenly thought, I wonder if these kids have been on holiday in their own country. And I said to Sam, how much would it cost to actually take these 80 kids and their parents, community of 150 people, on holiday, probably the only holiday of their life, to one of their own national parks? And he gave me the number. Do you know what the number was? It was less than we would spend on a bog standard 2-week holiday in Europe for a family. And there was money in the pot. Jesus said something really interesting about money. He says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be. When I invested in that holiday, it gave me such joy, and it still does to this day. And the more I invested in his kingdom, the more joy I got, more than the joy of a new house, a foreign holiday, whatever it might be. And then somebody said, why don't you meet a man called Eric in Paris? We'll meet at a bistro. Never a hard thing to do, to have a meeting in a Parisian bistro. I went there, and I said, Eric, what are you doing? He said, this was the beginning of the 2000s. I want to use the internet to convert the French. Good luck with that. How are you doing that? This was at the beginning of the internet, by the way. So my corporate clients were using the internet, but I hadn't met a Christian who was doing it. He said, I'm converting the gospel into like a 7-minute YouTube video called The Father's Love Letter. I'm then strategically using Google AdWords to draw people to watch it. And when they watch it, they can click on a link if they want to become a Christian. I went, that's smart. So what are you finding in terms of conversion rates? He said, for every 100 people who watch it, 4 people say they want to become a Christian. I went, that's extraordinary. And what's your vision? He said, well, I want to translate it into the other major languages. There are 30 of them. English, Spanish, Farsi, Japanese, Chinese, etc., etc. I went, how much would that cost? He gave me a number. There was money in our pot for it. And I'll tell you, I came out of that meeting and I'll tell you how I felt. Imagine, it's about 20, 30 years ago, you're in Harvard. Next door to you is a strange man called Mark Zuckerberg. And he wanders in one day and he said, I'm going to start this thing. I've got a weird name for it, Facebook, but I need some cash. And if you give me some cash, I'll give you shares in the business. If you knew then what you know now, what would you sell in order to get shares, be the first investor in Facebook? I would sell everything and wander around in underpants for a year. I'd persuade my parents to sell their home, cash in their chips. That's what I felt like. My mind space moved from, what's the minimum percentage I can get away with before God? And what is the most I can get for eternal treasure? Here's what I think. God pays us this is chocolate money. Can you see this? It's what you consume at Christmas. All the money we have this side of heaven is chocolate money. We can consume it, or when we invest it globally in what he's doing, locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, it becomes eternal treasure. And suddenly I was thinking, why should I spend 20 grand on a car when I can buy a old banger for 5 and invest 15 for eternity? Long story cut short, I'll take you to 2005. Our marriage collapsed. I was feeling awful. What was my first response to that? I'll buy myself a holiday home. That'll make me feel better. I like the sea, I like golf, I'll get somewhere there. And then a friend rang me up and said, don't be stupid, Richard, you're self-medicating your pain. There are better things to do with the money. And there were. There's a devotional I love called God Calling. 2 old ladies, about 100 years ago, anonymous. When they prayed, Jesus spoke to them and they wrote down what he said. And every January the 5th, I'd read this. This is what Jesus said to them about money. Don't be afraid of poverty. Let money flow freely. I will let it flow in, but you must let it flow out. I never send money to stagnate, only to those who pass it on. Keep nothing for yourself. Hoard nothing. Only have what you need and use. This is my law of discipleship. I wanted to be brave. I wanted to be braver. I wanted to be like that. I wanted to live without a safety net. So I stopped paying into my pension fund, and I set my lifestyle, and then I determined to give whatever the excess was away to invest it in the kingdom. I wanted to do that, but it was terrifying. Every January, I'd feel the enemy say to me, Richard, because I'm self-employed, at the beginning of a year, my diary's empty. Every January, I'd feel the enemy say to me, you know, this is the year you get found out. You know, this is the year that nobody's going to ring you. And I'd felt Jesus saying to me, will you give me until Christmas, Richard? If you're on a park bench at Christmas, we can have a conversation. For 15 years, I was fearing that park bench, and I've got 15 of these paper diaries in my bedroom to prove that you cannot outgive God, that God meets your needs in every conceivable way. And that, for me, was really, really exciting to be part of that journey. And then I'll take you to 2014, Christmas Eve. I'm in a hospital in Watford, and a young man who looks like he's about 16, is actually a doctor, comes and kneels down, looks up into my eyes. That's never a good sign, is it? And he says, you've got cancer. We think you've got cancer. On January the 5th, I was with an oncologist, and they confirmed it. My cancer was mesothelioma. It comes from asbestos. They reckon it comes from asbestos in old theaters, actually. And it's incurable. And they said, you've got about a year, 18 months to live. At that point, my son, who was in the meeting, had his laptop open. He said, Dad, I found it. I said, what have you found? He said, I found a mesothelioma joke. The oncologist was somewhat surprised. I said, okay, what's the joke? He said, how do you treat a patient with mesothelioma? As best as you can. Anyway, memorable moments. Since then, I've had chemotherapy, 2 big operations, 60 rounds of immunotherapy, 60 rounds of radiotherapy. A couple of months ago, they said the cancer's moved from the right lung to the left lung. It's stopped working, so we're going back to chemo. So I'm in the middle of chemo, so my brain's a fog, and I have to sit down. And here's my thought. The closer I get to death, the more grateful I am. Because I'll tell you this, if somebody's got a servant heart, I've got the opposite. I've been awful at talking about my faith to other people. I've been dreadful at inviting people to Alpha or Christianity Explored or whatever it might be. But the fact that Jesus gave me an opportunity to invest some of the money that he's given me in the first place, I mean, don't you find it fairly hysterical that a rather stupid unemployed actor is employed to advise people to persuade other people to give them hundreds of millions of pounds? I find that ludicrous. But the chance to make a difference. We have a cancer club at church. It's not the most popular club, to be fair. I like it. We've lost a few, we've gained a few over the years. One of my friends, Sandra, is dying at the moment. And she said, the closer I get to death, everything drops away apart from two things. Love, the love that God has for me, the love that I have for others, and making a difference. Every day, can I make a difference? She coaches from her bed 6 people. She's an extraordinary woman. And I can resonate with that. The chance to make a difference is so important to me. A young man called Ed phoned me up a couple of years ago. He said, we found a people group in India that has no gospel presence at all, and we found 15 Indian evangelists who want to go full-time to invest their time in reaching the gospel with them. I went, Ed, how much would that cost? He went, all in all, 15 full-time evangelists, unreached people group, £12,000 a year. £12,000 a year to change the lives of an entire people group. That really excited me. It still does. Let me end with 3 things I'd love to say to you. Do you know if Western evangelicals gave not 2.5%, but 10%, do you know how much more money would flood into the kingdom every year? I'll tell you, 100 billion pounds. That's 100,000 million pounds. That's the same that Putin is pouring into the war in Ukraine. Imagine that as a power for good across the West, across the world. But I'm not asking you to be more generous for that reason. It's for purely selfish reasons. This side of heaven, I've known very few things that give more joy than being a part of what God is doing financially. And in eternity, actually, we get this treasure. What is this treasure? John Lennox, who many of you know is a maths professor at Oxford, lovely Christian man, and he's written a book on what to do when we invest our time and treasure and talent. And he uses the story that Jesus tells of the dodgy steward who used money to buy friends. And he says, when we invest our time and our treasure in what God is doing, we make friends. We make friends. I have friends all over the world by God's grace. And I'm so looking forward to getting to heaven because we're going to sit down and I'm going to hear their stories. And the fact that I've been able to play some tiny, 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 minuscule part in their stories thrills me now, and I know will thrill me then. I hope that's part of my treasures. One of my great heroes in life is a man called George Muller. For those of you who don't know, George Muller was a Victorian German gentleman who God called to move to Bristol, and God called to look after orphans. And in the course of his life, he looked after 10,000 orphans. He's one of the founding fathers of orphan care in the UK. George Muller's life has 2 extraordinary elements to it. Number 1, he never asked anybody for money, and looking after 10,000 orphans costs a lot of money. The only person he asked was God. Every day he asked God, and God gave him 210 million pounds at today's prices. Now, why could God trust him so much? I think the second thing that makes Muller extraordinary is of the 210 million pounds that God gave him, he gave away to other ministries all across the world 70 million. 1/3 he gave away. Do you know what Muller's legacy is? Because at some time he supported 200 missionaries in China. Muller's legacy isn't just what he's achieved in the UK, it's the growth of the Chinese church. Muller's legacy 150 years later is the 120 million Christians in China who were there because partly of what he funded. So my question to you is, are you not just serving your local communities and your churches, but are you serving the global church? Because Western money can make a huge difference. Let's take the 4 million that we spent on our refurb in our church. If you invested 1 million and you gave it to my friend Ed and a charity called 500K in India. India, you know, has 500,000 villages with no Christian presence at all. 1 million there would support 500 full-time evangelists for 3 years and lead to the planting of between 1,000 and 1,500 churches. If you put 1 million to work in Africa, where so many families live on less than $1 a day, and you gave it to a Christian charity called 5 Talents, you'd actually support 10,000 women, the poorest of the poor, to be able to read and write and count and save and earn their way out of poverty. If you invested 1 million in Bible translation, because we know without the Bible you can't evangelize, and there are still 2 billion people on the planet with no translation of Scripture in their heart language. If you invested just 1 million, you'd be able to translate the Bible for a people group of 20 million and make God's story accessible to them. And then if you were really strategic and you decided to use the internet to access the 12 least reached countries in the world, do you know what 1 million would achieve if you gave it to Jesus.net, who are very smart at this stuff? You'd basically, in those 12 countries, enable the gospel to be seen 100 million times, which would lead to 200,000 people indicating that they wanted to come to Christ and to be followed up online. Think of the difference that 4 million can make around the world. The last thing I want to say is this: thank you. Thank you and bless you in everything you have done for his kingdom, in everything you are doing, and in everything you will do. Bless you.
Challenging stuff, isn't it? Let me make just a couple of really quick observations on what Richard said, and then I'm going to explain where we feel God is leading us in this and how you can be involved in that. I love for Richard, all of this journey of generosity that he went on, it all started in prayer. It all started in prayer. There was that simple prayer at the start, just to not live out of a suitcase, but actually all along, he had very honest conversations with God where he wanted to be brave, he wanted to be generous, but moments where he was terrified and he was fearful. And if we're going to live radically generous lives, it won't always be easy, and it has to come out of relationship with Jesus. I want to be really honest with you. I'm on a journey with this. I don't want you to think that I think that this is easy. When I give, it can sometimes still feel like it's out of duty and not out of joy. And I know there's a fear in me. There's a fear of not having enough. There's a fear of lack, a fear that God won't provide. And I want to be a good steward of the money that God has given me. But I also know that sometimes the fear that I have stops me from being more generous. I love how at every moment in Richard's story, Jesus proved his faithfulness. And as Richard made that countercultural decision not to inflate his lifestyle as he earned more, but instead to give more and more away, Jesus took him on that adventure of changing his heart and bringing him deep joy. And I believe Jesus wants to do the same in us. Kings has always been an incredibly generous church. We heard 2 weeks ago the story of how when the site for this building became available in the 90s, 29 couples in our church handed the deeds of their properties to the bank as security against the loan. That takes faith. That takes generosity. And I wasn't here at the time, but my guess is there will have been some fear in that and some hard conversations in that. And now as God takes us on the next step in our journey with him, there may be fear in it. But we also believe there are depths of joy in giving that we've yet to discover and that Jesus is inviting us into. So how can we be all in this area of giving? Well, we see the New Testament model of giving as simply this, that we give regularly, proportionately, sacrificially, and joyfully. And at Kings, we have a main church fund that pays for things like our staff salary. So it enables us to run things like King's Kids, King's Youth, all our ministries, our pastoral work. It pays for the upkeep of the building and all our facility costs. And so if you're not yet giving regularly to the church and you feel Jesus is stirring you to start giving this morning, we'd encourage you to start there. That's the invitation to you. We see the tithe, giving 10% of your income to the church, as a really helpful biblical guideline. It's a guideline, it's not a rule. And no one in the church knows what anyone else gives. But if you're already giving regularly to the church, then from today we're introducing a new way of giving that's over and above what we give to the church fund, and it's called Giving Beyond. It's called Giving Beyond. So on your seat, you'll see there's a booklet explaining what this is all about. Don't read it now. but really want to encourage you to take that home and to pray about it and to consider what it means for you. But let me just say a few things about that right now. The first is this. This is rooted in what we believe God is saying to us as a church. So more than 10 years ago, we had a prophetic word spoken over us, and it's a word that we feel God is calling us to take hold of today and to press into. The word was this, that God is going to begin to use this church as a resource financially, to finance mission, to finance what God is going to do. And that is what Giving Beyond is all about. It's about us becoming all the more a church that resources kingdom advance in three ways: beyond our walls, beyond our borders, and beyond our generations. So until now, we've had 2 gift days a year where we've asked the church to give one-off gifts over and above our regular giving. And that money went into 2 funds. It went into our Hope Fund to support local outreach and into our Vision Fund. But now we're simplifying things so that the work that these funds support is now all part of Giving Beyond. And what we're asking you to do, instead of making one-off gifts throughout the year, is to consider making Giving Beyond a regular part of your giving. So to give regularly to the church fund and to give regularly to our Giving Beyond fund to see the kingdom advance beyond our walls, beyond our borders, and beyond our generations. And of course, some of this is about continuing to resource the ministries and work that we're already involved in. So things beyond our walls, like our work with Chosen, reaching out to women in our town caught in commercial sexual exploitation. Our partnership with Christians Against Poverty. You know, since we started that work with CAP, we've seen more than 100 families in our town go debt-free. It's amazing. Many of those people are now part of our church family. It's incredible work. Our local outreach work is now part of Giving Beyond. And then there are the things that we're already involved in beyond our borders. So Richard talked about investing in great people doing great things. And we're seeing that already. Amazing people like Amos and Jen out in Kathmandu in Nepal sharing the gospel and seeing people saved and baptized and added to the church. They're making disciples in a culture that is increasingly hostile to the gospel. That is eternal treasure. Or people like Jackie and their husband Wes in South Sudan, they're translating the Bible into local languages. That is incredible work. It's hard and it's tireless and it's complex, but it's putting the word of God into the hands of people who'd otherwise have no access to the gospel. That is eternal treasure. So there are things that we're already doing that are now part of Giving Beyond, but we believe there's so much more that we can do. You know, there's so much more need in our town and much further afield. There's so much more brokenness for us to step into. There's so many more areas where we want to see the light of the kingdom of God break into the darkness that people are experiencing. We want to be able to operate out of surplus so that as new needs and opportunities come up, both locally and further afield, we're in a position to be able to pray and then say, yes, we can help with that. And you know, if we're to follow God's call to explore a new church building, then we also need to start setting aside money for that. And Giving Beyond will help us to do that. And let me just pick up on what Richard said about buildings. Because, you know, he's right that this should never become the main thing. The building should never be the main thing. Because building projects can be expensive. They can consume money and time and energy. And so as we look for a new church building, it mustn't be at the expense of all the other things that we're doing right now. And actually, we don't want to pull back from what we're doing. In fact, we want to reach out all the more and take new opportunities as they come up. So as we've prayed about this, we've set a faith target for the coming year. And that is this. It's to raise £300,000 for Giving Beyond between now and next August, on top of giving to our main church fund. And that is a stretch for us. You know, our last 2 gift days raised £124,000, and that in itself was just hugely generous on the part of the church. But so hitting this target of £300,000 will require faith and sacrifice from all of us. And that's on top of increasing the amount that we give to our main church fund. So what can we all do in this? Well, this is highlighted in your booklet, but just 3 things I want to mention. And that's plan, vision, and dream. Plan, vision, and dream. So first of all, pray and make a plan of what you'll give. So what you'll give to the church fund and what you want to give beyond. And your booklet explains exactly how to give. Can I just say this? If you're already giving to the church, please don't decrease that amount. So you could hear about giving beyond and think, well, that sounds amazing. Let's just give to that. The problem is that without giving to the church, there's no giving beyond. So if you usually give one-off gifts at gift day, think, how much do you usually give at those gift days? And what would it look like to instead give that across the year now in regular monthly amounts? What would that look like each month? And could you stretch that? Could you add more each month? Always giving out of what you have and never putting yourself in debt, because Jesus doesn't ask that of us. So there's the planned amount. But then also ask God to give you a vision for what you could give if God gave you more money. So go to him in prayer and say, Lord, I'm planning to give this. But actually, if you were to put this amount in my hands, I would give it away. Keep praying into that. And in the coming weeks, in the coming months, we're going to keep coming back to this, and we're going to tell you regular stories of how the money that we're giving together is making a difference, both locally and much, much further afield. So have a planned amount. Have that vision amount. And then why not let's ask God for a dream amount? Let's be audacious in this. You know, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. He has unlimited resources. So let's be audacious. Let's ask for that huge dream amount, way beyond what we can give right now, that we'd love to give further down the line if God grows us in this. And I appreciate that this, for many of us, will represent a new and different and challenging way of living. I get that, because it's different for me too. But Jesus is inviting us to go on an adventure of faith here, together as a church family that will see the kingdom advance and bring us new depths of joy as we give. So the question is, will we say yes to that call to go deeper in our relationship, to go on that adventure of giving with him? And of course, some will give more because they have more. And some will give less because they have less. But as we finish, I come back to what I said right at the start, that really it's all about the heart. It's all about the heart, because what made Richard live the kind of life that he led? What led the early church to give generously? Well, it wasn't compulsion, it wasn't coercion, it was hearts changed by Jesus. Paul writes, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich." What an incredibly generous God we have. For God so loved the world that he gave. The Father gave his Son. The Son gave his life. Church, when we give, may it be out of an overflow of joy at what God has done for us. Amen? Amen.